All right, newly elected District Attorney Mike Schmidt, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time. How can you reflect on the past, 10 or 12 days, not considering you getting the newly elected position, but just the country and the city and the county and the state in general?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. My probably like so many, it's been really hard to, you start with watching the video as I did, and it was horrific to see how George Floyd was killed, and we knew it wasn't right, and so I immediately, like so many others, went out into the community, listening to some of our leaders in the community how they're dealing with it, and I went from frustration, anger. We've done this before. This keeps happening. How do we change this? To where I'm now, starting to get a little bit more hopeful that this feels different than previous times we've done this. That now is a time where people are really willing and listening and ready to make some changes.
The responsibility of the district attorney is massive at any time. Do you feel, though, pressure has increased now, considering the way people will be looking at your office and what you do moving forward?
It has and it hasn't. It definitely has in some ways where I've seen people online saying, this is exactly why we elected Mike Schmidt. He represents the change we need. And that's why we did it. We're so excited for him to get in there. And I feel like there's a pressure for me to go in and immediately fix a bunch of things. And as I think rationally people know that even at this moment, it's still going to take time, and we're going to need to have thoughtful and thorough conversations about how changes need to happen. So that's where I feel more pressure. But on the opposite side, I was running on a very progressive change platform. And even as I was running and committing to these positions and knowing that this is where I believed our system needed to go, I know that I would have met a lot of resistance on a lot of the things. And so in some ways, I feel like some of that resistance is starting to go away. I've had people reach out to me who didn't vote for me and say, maybe you were onto something with that change stuff you were talking about. So hearts and minds, I think, have moved a little bit. So in some ways, more pressure, but in some ways, I think we're ready.
Do you have any examples of some of the things you think might have been more difficult to get done before that you feel like you have an easier path to doing now?
Yeah, I think I've heard a lot of conversations around cash bail. And we know in Multnomah County, when you look at who is being held in our jail before their trial, we see a lot of disparity. I believe the number was somewhere around 29% of people held in jail pretrial in Multnomah County pre-COVID, before we really decreased our jail population, were Black. And, that's obviously with about 6% of the population in the county, that's wildly disparate. I think issues like that, people are now saying, people of all walks are saying, what, that isn't right. We should be taking a look at that. And if money is the reason that we're holding people and not because they're a danger to the public or not because they never show up, we ought to that. And hopefully that can drive down disparity. So cash bail, sentencing reform, same thing. We've talked a lot about mass incarceration. And how we're using our resources, how many people are incarcerated at the state level. And I think now we're having a conversation in our community about, do the budget priorities that we've established in the state and in locally, do they really reflect our community values? Or should we be changing where some of those budgets are being allocated? And I think mass incarceration is one of those things that people are going to be more willing to say, what? Instead of investing in prisons and holding people and not really treating them or working with them, let's invest in schools and community that has been impacted by crime, by not having opportunity.
As we build up those communities with more money for education or more resources for people to live better lives in those communities to keep them away from committing crimes, what do we do with the people in the meantime who are not going to see an immediate fix and do continue to commit crimes? Would that money go to different types of ways to rehabilitate them outside of prisons?
I think that's right. Yeah, I don't think it's zero sum. I don't think we have to stop current enforcement in order to invest in our future. And so I think it is looking at, are the investments that we're making now the best ones? And prison is expensive. Jail is expensive. If we can keep you in the community where we're ensuring public safety, making sure that people are going to treatment, that they're checking with their probation officer, that we have the wraparound services that they need. We're talking about a difference between in prison over $100 a day as one of the estimates versus in the community, you could probably do a very serious wraparound service level caseload at about $30 a day, which is still less than the state gives us in our community to pay for that. But you can see that if we change the way our resources are allocated, I think we can actually create more public safety, get better long-term results, and have money to invest in the long-term things to help rebuild and build up communities.
There's also an argument that once people are incarcerated, that it is nearly impossible for them to restart their life, that they always wear that with them as they try to continue, even if they have overall goals to become productive citizens. Is there a thought when it comes to that as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we see examples of people who do make it and they do change their lives, but really, a lot of times they're the exception to the rule. Our statewide recidivism rates for people leaving prison is 50 to 60%, and recidivism means they are arrested for a new crime within 3 years of leaving prison. So it's not working, and that's because when we send you to prison, you're not getting treatment. You're not dealing with whatever the underlying issues you were that got you in there in the first place. You're not fixing those things. And in fact, you're meeting some new friends and making unhealthy relationships. And then, as you point out, you re-enter the community. And now you have a felony on your record, at least. You have a gap in your job resume because you've been out of our community for a period of time. You probably didn't receive the job training or the underlying issue training that you needed to deal with those things. And so, yeah, we are setting people up for failure. And it really does become a situation where it's very hard to get yourself out of that cycle. And I do think it's the exception to the rule of people that are able to succeed in spite of our system and sometimes not because of.
To revisit the bail conversation quickly, just so I have clarity, do you want to eliminate cash bail entirely?
Yes, I think we should be looking at, is it equitable to hold somebody in jail, to deprive them of their liberty because they don't have money? I think it's a fair thing to deprive someone of their liberty if we need to do that in order to ensure the safety of the community. That I think is fair. Or I think it's okay to do that and fair and constitutionally okay to do it if they continue to not show up to court. At some point, somebody has to be held so that they can be held accountable. But if the reason we're holding you is because you don't have money, I think that, quite frankly, we have constitutional problems with that. And it obviously cuts across communities that are less likely to have money. Minority communities who have been disadvantaged for decades and centuries are going to be more likely to fall into the category of not having the resources. So yeah, I think money is a bad proxy for who should be let out and who should be held in our jails. I'd like to eliminate it altogether. We have to have a serious conversation about how then, what mechanisms then do we use to hold people when they are not safe to be released or they never show up. But those are things that we can do. And there are jurisdictions around the country that have had those conversations, and we can learn from their successes and some of their failures.
Any off the top of your head that we could take a look at just as we prepare to further this conversation in the media?
Oh, absolutely. Washington, D.C. has been doing it for a long time. John Oliver actually a few years ago did a special on them. The federal system uses cash bail a lot less than the state system does. New Jersey is a great state that has really made the change more recently. New Mexico as well. New York has made some changes, but they've gotten a lot of pushback in terms of how successful they've been. California and Alaska has also. So different states are trying different approaches, and it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag of success, and I think we should take all of that in and learn from it.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn more about it. Talk to me about the protesters. So police have arrested at least 200 protesters, more at this point. Over the past couple of weeks. Those are going to be headed to your office. What is your stance on how those people should be, you could even, what happens, I guess? Let me just start from the beginning. When you have this many people being arrested during these types of protests, how does that look when it shows up to your office?
Yeah. Right now, I imagine what it looks like is the district attorney's office is screening probably on a daily basis between 20 and 50 reports from the night before to make and determine whether or not there's probable cause for charges to be filed. And then they make that decision. For me, what I take office, the thing that is really driven a lot of my thinking around public safety is, what are we trying to accomplish? I just
Roomba?
had a vacuum cleaner turn on behind me. Hold on a second. Let me shut it off.
Thanks.
That was random. Sorry.
I like random. Random's fun for me. That's great. Thank you.
It's like,
yeah. So
it
if
could
you
have been
just
my
want
3-year-old. It could have been a vacuum cleaner. Who knows?
You know what? Those usually make the best moments in this current state of interviews, when you just see people randomly kind of walk into the background, take over the interview space. But yeah. So just to go back, a lot of people said that I've seen a lot of write-ups saying that these charges never stick in these cases. That often the people who have been committing what are real crimes don't really have to stand for them at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think they are challenging to prosecute. The district attorney's office took a case recently, not from these protests, but from prior protests, to trial. And the jury acquitted the woman of the charges of interfering with a peace officer and disorderly conduct. It's very hard to convince a jury that when somebody is exercising their constitutional rights to free speech, that's a good use of our resources to prosecute them criminally and then try to, impose some sort of a punishment on them. Quite frankly, I think for most people, your typical protester, a lot of them are, they're there, they're nonviolent, obvious. They don't have a history of getting arrested or a record like that. Getting arrested is a traumatic thing. I think we could consider whether or not that might be punishment enough for not listening to a police officer in the moment, and question whether or not it really is worth our community's resources to have them get appointed a public defender, go through a trial process, just to ultimately have a Multnomah County jury end up acquitting them. So I think the district attorney's office has its work cut out for it in reviewing these cases and then considering what really is the best way to handle these.
Some people would argue that there's nothing to incentivize these protesters from remaining peaceful, because there have been a lot of efforts to take away some of the police resources, the use of tear gas and crowd control measures like that when things start to get out of hand. And then people who do get arrested don't really have much more punishment outside of the process of being arrested that evening. What do you say to the people who think that we're lightening up too much and that it's going to create more chaos and put police lives in danger or property in danger?
Well, and I agree. I hear that sentiment frequently, but I think it's been instructive to see the change since the federal judge ruled that the Portland police are restrained from using tear gas for the next 14 days. At least immediately in the aftermath, we actually seem to see a de-escalation of violence and tension when police officers weren't using those kinds of crowd control methods. So I think there is something to be said for, are we coming in as a militarized police force actually raising the likelihood of conflict? And should we be considering that these de-escalation tactics and maybe not engaging and not, setting up for battle with our own community who's expressing their views, if we can actually bring down the amount of violence and conflict? Obviously, there are some bad actors that are kind of among the crowd, and some of them seem to have conflicting agendas and things that they are trying to accomplish. And you're going to need to intercede with specific individuals who are, damaging property, breaking windows, things of that nature. But I think what we're seeing is these mass holistic kind of approaches of using something like tear gas that affects hundreds of people that were not at all engaged in any kind of a violent protest, is actually serving us poorly and ramps up the tensions and probably makes both the protesters and the police officers less safe ultimately.
So you ran on a platform of reform, and clearly you have momentum in doing so nationwide and in this city and in this state to accomplish the goals that you ran on. That said, you're also here, and one of your big passions, I assume, is to make sure that people who are doing the wrong things in this community are taken off of the streets and are rehabilitated, but in some cases have to be punished for their violent crimes. We're looking at a large defunding of the police department. I think it was $17 million was going to be taken from the budget, and people were saying that wasn't enough. They want $50 million taken away from Portland police. Being someone who relies on them to give you enough evidence to seek justice in many cases, what's your impression of that?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, as much as I do believe that we need to reform our system, it's because I think that we can do a better job and we can create more public safety by approaching things different than the way that we've been doing it. It's not because I think that people should not be held accountable for violent crimes or that we should not be prosecuting those cases. I think what I'm taking away from this conversation is the community is loudly about the investments that we've been making for a long time, and whether or not they're meeting our needs or also our philosophy of what we want to see have happen. So, of course, I'm concerned. I want, gun violence, for example, is a problem that plagues our community. I take that extremely seriously. It's extremely dangerous. I don't want anybody getting shot in our community. But what we're hearing from the city council and from the people is that the way we have been going about tackling gun violence is not working for them, and it's not standing up to our values. So I think what we're doing right now is having a conversation about realigning resources and prioritizing investments. But for me, and why I want to be at that table is because at the end of the day, you're exactly right. What's important to me is community safety. And we need to make sure that if we are changing our focus or changing how we're making these investments, that might be fine. I'm a big believer in we can find more efficient and better ways to do and hit the same goals. But let's make sure that we know what our goals are and that we are, in fact, measuring them and then making sure that these new strategies are having the impact that we want to maintain our public safety.
Is there some anxiety taking your investigators, your detectives, your gun crimes detectives off of the streets? I mean, those are the people that give you the evidence you need to secure a conviction.
I think there's always anxiety when there's change like this. And I haven't yet been plugged into the conversation about what the thought process is around still making sure that we're reducing gun violence. So, I'm very welcoming of the conversation. And I want to see, okay, great. The community has spoken. The way we were approaching it is not the way the community wants us to approach it. How are we going to approach it and make sure that we're still doing it? So, yeah. Anxiety in that way, but I'm also hopeful that, as long as we have the right focus, that we know we have to reduce things like gun crime. I'm open to the idea that there are better ways to do it than the way we've been doing it.
When are you part of the conversation? What's the date of when do you start?
Officially January 1st, I take office.
So when you do, how are you coming in day one? What's on your plate? What do you want to accomplish? What's the most important stuff you want to take care of?
I think there's going to be some things that have been put on my agenda for me. For example, just dealing with the COVID-19 crisis and what that's done to our criminal justice system, our court system, backlogging cases. We're going to have to immediately figure out how are we dealing with not only a massive backlog, but just our regular day-to-day in an office that's already staffed very thinly. So I think that's going to be a priority of figuring that out. Obviously, police accountability is something that I'm going to be listening to community members and working on what are going to be my concrete policies on day one to make sure that this community is assured that I take that responsibility very seriously. And another big thing that I ran on was transparency. And making my office's data publicly available to anybody, just like I've worked on and done at the state level. I'm committed to doing that as fast as I can at the local level so that we can actually see when we're making changes like this, are we getting the results that we're hoping to get? Are we getting better off or not? But if you can't do that, if you don't have the data.
I'm going to end with a softball question for you. You can just go ahead and knock out of the park, but not just personally, somebody elected to this position, I think one of the reasons that you were elected was not just the reform, but the passion you have for this position. And here you are taking it on during a time that could amount to great change in this state and in this country. How do you feel about that responsibility and that opportunity?
Yeah, it's an incredible responsibility, and really an amazing opportunity. I'm very hopeful. I'm very energized by the conversations happening in our community. I think we need to act thoughtfully and deliberatively. And so I'm hopeful to get to be a part of the conversation and really do things in a way that have all of the right things at the center. So our community values, can we and how do we reduce, because we must, racial disparity in our criminal justice system? How do we do that and keep our communities more safe and make investments where they need to be made? For me, really, this has been a time of great excitement and trepidation and anxiety, but also, I think that this opportunity does not come around very frequently, and it's a tremendous responsibility, and I'm very excited to be able to put into practice a lot of the things I've been thinking about for a long time.
Mike Schmidt, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and thank you, Roomba, for the little interjection.
Scheduled maintenance of my rug.
Hey, man,
Thanks,
no
Dan.
problem. Yeah, thanks again. Hey, we'll talk soon. Good luck to you.